Hey everybody, I'm meteorologist Ryan Hanrahan. Things are getting a little bit active in the tropics. We've had a nice break. Things have been pretty quiet for a little bit, but it looks like that is beginning to change, and things are getting more interesting as we go through the next couple days. So let's start by taking a look at the satellite loop. We've got a tropical wave that has come off the coast of Africa, and at least right now it's relatively poorly organized. It's moving slowly. The atmosphere is not terribly favorable for this thing to develop, so at least initially we're not expecting it to do all that much. And it's pretty far out there. It's at about 30 degrees west. So we've got a ton of time to watch this thing as it moves across the Atlantic. But this is going to be the next system, almost certainly, that will head toward the Leeward Islands, and then we'll see what it does from there. If it's going to curve out to sea, which is the most likely scenario, or will it sort of menace the coast. Right now, again, out to sea, most likely here, but I'll show you why that's not a certainty at this point. So let's take a look at what we've got going on. This is the 7-day tropical weather outlook from the National Hurricane Center, and you can see the Hurricane Center giving this storm, this wave, about a 70% chance of development. So that means a 70% chance of it becoming a tropical storm or hurricane. That's over the next 7 days. So at least initially, for the next 48 hours, the odds of development pretty low, only about 30%. But those numbers begin to increase as we go through the next week, and there's the potential, as the storm moves farther to the west, that it's going to enter about a week from now an atmosphere that's far more conducive to development. So that's what we're watching. Again, that's going to be over the weekend and into early next week. So let's take a look at what our computer models are doing, because they are beginning to show the potential for a more significant storm. And that's why I wanted to give you an update here. So at least initially, this doesn't do a whole lot, right? So the storm moves to the west pretty slowly. It remains on the weaker side. You can see here the blues and the greens. Those are winds 30, 40, 50 knots, so that's a tropical storm. You don't get into the stronger, the brighter colors until you get about a week from now or a bit longer. And this is the European computer model, the European ensembles, and they are developing a fairly substantial system, at least most of them, a pretty substantial hurricane as it heads toward the Leeward Islands. So the question is, all right, where does it go? So if you take a look at these clusters here, there's one cluster that's farther to the south, and this would be a more direct impact to the Leeward Islands, to Puerto Rico, and to Haiti and the Dominican Republic. But most of our computer models, I'd say about 2/3 of them, keep the storm to the north. So the spaghetti plot showing, again, some potential for an impact on the southern end of things, but more likely scenario would be farther to the north. If you remember Aaron continually tracked on the southern side of guidance, so something to keep in mind, something to watch here. So can't rule out an impact to the Leeward Islands, even though at least right now it's not the most likely scenario. So let's take a look at what we've got going on synoptically, so the big broad weather pattern, and I can show you what's happening here with the storm. So if you watch closely, look at the cursor here. That is the center of what we expect to become Gabrielle as it moves to the west, and it's being steered to the west by this big ridge of high pressure. This is a pretty semi-permanent setup and something you see all the time in September across the Atlantic Ocean, and that's steering the storm to the west. Eventually, though, it begins to break down, just like we saw with Aaron. So the storm, as it moves to the west, it's going to have an opportunity to curve to the north, and then eventually gets caught in the jet stream, which is up here where the colors are sort of tightly packed together. That's the jet stream. That should take the storm and move it harmlessly out to sea. But just like we had with Aaron, I'll go back in time here, the question is, well, how quickly does the ridge break down? Or does the ridge back west a little bit, and that would force a more western and a more southern track, which would impact Puerto Rico and the Leeward Islands. So that's what we're going to be watching over the next couple of days. What does this ridge of high pressure do? How strong is it? And when and where does it begin to break down? Does it begin to break down closer to Bermuda, or does it wait until the storm gets a little bit farther to the west? So that's the question we've got here. Let's take a look here. This is, I wanted to show you this one because it's a little interesting. Now, the reason I'm showing this is just to show you that it's just one possible scenario here, although it's quite unlikely. This is the new GFS computer model. We like to call this the happy hour run of the GFS, coming in during the late evening, or during the evening, I should say. And it's got a pretty interesting little setup here. Watch what happens as the storm comes to the west. It sort of meanders over the Atlantic. It begins to strengthen. It becomes a pretty formidable storm, a pretty formidable hurricane as it moves to the west. And then eventually it comes to the north. But watch what happens. It sort of plays around near Bermuda and then hooks left toward New England and then sort of goes up into the Canadian Maritimes. Super unlikely that would happen, but if you start seeing that around social media, you start seeing these posts talking about what a nightmare scenario we've got coming up, just so you know, is one of hundreds of computer model runs that we're looking at. So again, the setup here, so instead of that one GFS run that sort of has that funky little thing off the East Coast, this is a look at a couple dozen of those same computer models tweaked a little bit to give us an idea of possible scenarios. And watch what happens here. Here, if you look closely, would be the future of Gabrielle moving to the west. Again, most indications are it passes north of the Leeward Islands, but this ridge is still steering it to the west. And then eventually, as that ridge breaks down, the storm gets captured and moved to the north and east out to sea. So that's the same basic setup we had for Aaron, but still, it's early enough on in the process that we just have to watch it pretty carefully. In terms of how strong the storm is, what I want to show you, this is what we call potential vorticity, and it does a nice job in the tropics of picking up these little troughs. We call them TUTs, or tropical upper tropospheric troughs, and those tend to produce a lot of wind shear. And so where you see these colors to the north, that's where you'd have sort of enhanced wind shear. And at least initially, not a lot of wind shear over this thing. There's a little bit of it, but there's an opportunity for it to strengthen as it moves to the west, because you get this, if you look here, you got this little bubble that sort of appears around the storm, sort of a safety bubble for this storm, and that's a ridge of high pressure, an anticyclone. If that develops like the GFS is showing, you could see a more substantial hurricane because it'll allow the storm's outflow to really develop. And so that's what we'll be watching. We'll be watching these tuts to the north and to the northwest and see if they sort of abate and allow the storm to develop that anticyclone or that ridge of high pressure overhead. And that's when these things really start to get going and go pretty strongly. And in terms of what to expect as the storm moves west, I'm going to show you here. Watch the storm here coming to the west. At least initially, it's sort of surrounded by, see this brown? It's a lot of dry air. So at least initially, it may struggle with some dry air nearby. But it looks like things do moisten up a little bit around it by the time we get to early next week. So something to watch here. At least initially, not that favorable for development, but you get more favorable for development the further along you go in time. Back here in North America in the lower 48, just an update on the weather pattern in general. The pattern recently has been sort of split. The western part of the U.S., and especially western Canada, very, very warm, big ridge of high pressure, big trough of low pressure across the eastern half of the country. And that sort of sticks around through the weekend. We've got a good upper level low, really anomalous for the time of year, over portions of Ontario and the northeast. That's going to allow some colder air to move in and sort of sets up for a while. So I don't think there's really a whole lot of change here over the next week to 10 days. And as we take a look at the temperature anomalies here through time, I'm going to start now. You can see, a bit colder than normal, especially across the Midwest and the plains and the Mid-Atlantic. And then we get a good shot of colder than normal air. These blues here and purples, temperature anomalies about 5,000 feet above our head, about 10 Celsius below normal. So a pretty good shot of some colder air. Probably a little bit of snow over the weekend in the portions of Minnesota and Ontario. It's not likely, but it's possible. And then that colder air rushes toward the coast. And early next week, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, looks pretty cool. I think there'll probably be a little bit of frost across New England and upstate New York. Pretty good cold shot rolling in. And so the extended outlook is for cooler than normal temperatures for next week for a good chunk of the eastern half of the country. But then to the west, the high plains, Rockies, and then most of central and western Canada, some really, really hot weather. And in terms of big storminess, we've got this big cold front that's going to allow that colder air to move in, heads toward New England on Friday, and then a follow-up shot on Saturday. Could produce some stronger thunderstorms on Saturday. So we will be watching that as it moves to the east. So thanks for watching. We're going to be keeping you updated on Gabrielle. We'll see what happens with it as it moves west. I think that's sort of going to be our next item of interest here. Most likely scenario, the curb out to sea, which is great. We'll take that, but still not a zero chance that it could impact the Leeward Islands. So we'll be watching it carefully for you, and we'll keep you posted with any developments over the next couple days. Thanks for watching.